your own podcast, moving up in the world. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Hey everybody, it's Razib, and I am here with Samo Burja. Samo, could you introduce yourself?
Thank you for having me on the show. I am the founder of Bismarck Analysis and a research fellow at the Long Now Foundation. Bismarck's a political risk consulting firm, and the Long Now Foundation is focused on long-term civilizational thinking. Hopefully, it'll become apparent why those two affiliations are so relevant to our interests, to our mutual interests, I should say.
Yeah. I actually don't know about your name very much in terms of I haven't met too many people with your forename, but where are you originally from?
I'm originally from Slovenia. Slovenia
Okay.
is a small Central European country. It's very interesting because it's the only communist Alpine country, and it's the only Slavic Alpine country. And it's, in the Western world, technically, this region was part of the Holy Roman Empire, but it's always, at the very edge of it. It exists at the very edge of the Western world historically.
Yeah. Yeah, because so the only other person who I know, or I mean, I've encountered people with the name Samo before from that part of the world, but in my own consciousness, Samo, who was the Frankish merchant who had a short-lived empire in Central Europe. So do you guys read much about that in East Central Europe, I would say, or Central Europe?
That's almost certainly where the name comes from. Samo became a figure of interest in 19th century literature among the Slavic people of the Austro-Hungarian Empire for the quite understandable reason that they wanted to pick up some non-German history to sort of justify, this national pride and this desire for revival. And Samo's kind of an interesting figure. He's, the consensus history on him is I think that he's just a Frankish arms merchant that forges a whole new state in the region by an alliance of 12 tribes. An alliance also sealed by marriage, right? So, if you go under the spouse section on Wikipedia, it says 12 Bendish noblewomen.
Yeah, and so when I encountered Samo, I think I was reading some Chris Wickham, who does a lot of work in early medieval Europe. And so Samo, as you said, he's a Frankish merchant, and he is actually from kind of like north central France, is apparently where he's supposedly from, maybe in the early 600s. So he comes from a matrix of a relatively Christianized society. Uh, but he goes, and ends up in Central Europe, and culturally, he was obviously assimilated. His descendants were all assimilated. They had to be re-Christianized, and the Wends, in particular, was pretty late. It was many centuries later. So I thought it was an interesting illustration of a phenomena we've seen elsewhere more recently. The white Maharajas of Sarawak and Sabah, just basically people from a foreign culture. You might want to say it's more advanced. They definitely have some advantages compared to more small scale societies. And they come into these societies, and like in The Man Who Would Be King, they are elevated to a position of leadership because of their knowledge, their skills, their foresights, their charisma. And some of it is obviously individual, it's individual to them. But some of it is because of the social context from which they come, and I can give other examples, but I want to focus on Samo because it's relevant to you, I think, in a way, or it's more topical to you. And this relates to your idea of a social technology. And I've used this idea because I don't really know of any other term that applies to this, but it's something that I think is intuitively obvious. So can you talk about that?
Well, there's something very interesting when you read, say, any account of history, right? You might have some amount of focus put on various kinds of material technology, right? The introduction of iron, or the spread of the syrup, or the invention of the steam engine, or at least Watt's steam engine. And there's a lot of historical focus on these. But I think when it comes to, say, culture, society, having that same sort of technical mindset of what is the consequence of an introduction of a new practice, I think that's done much less frequently, right? A social technology would be any kind of transformation of the social world of humans. And I think it's a fact that the social world of humans is transformed over and over again. We're not completely stuck at the exact same social pattern over time. It's possible to do things like change marriage laws, for example. There's an argument, a very strong argument to be made, that the bans on cousin marriage in Western Europe have had an immense effect on the history, perhaps eventually even the biology of that region of the world. Other things that are less easy to measure the impact of, such as the spread of Roman law or common law, that certainly changes the way economic interactions happen. Things like, dub- double entry bookkeeping, things like the organized religions of the axial age. Social technologies, in fact, allow our societies at times to scale or to double down in intensity in exploiting particular features of the natural environment. So I think that social technologies can be as relevant in how much people get out of their physical environment as physical technology does. In fact, I would maintain that you can't really have large complexes of material technology, at least not ones that require scale, without supportive and symbiotic social tech. And we can get into concrete examples of this or dive into any of the details here.
Yeah. I think that's very concise, and I think a lot of the listeners are going to kind of intuitively understand it and just grok what you're saying, because there have been so many cases, especially in the recent past, of the introduction of you know physical, let's say, like non-social scientific technologies, right? So, like, I guess, like, technology in Greek is from the science of craft, art, skill, cunning of hand. So obviously that's implying some sort of physical thing. So that's why you say, social technology. But so, for example, Muhammad Ali Pasha's Egypt in the 19th century, where they went on a debt service spending spree to try to develop capital infrastructure and educational and technological system to catch up with the West. And, just by brute force, they did, you know, advance somewhat, but ultimately it's perceived as a failure. And, the reason is given in a very vague way. Well, Egyptian culture didn't change. It didn't create, the conditions for the sort of innovation and the bureaucratic state that you had in Western Europe at the time. And so it doesn't matter how many engineers you train. Uh, those engineers, if they don't have a social system in which to operate rationally and efficiently in, are not going to leverage the utility of modern engineering. So I think that's, a classical example. And so what happened there is Egypt did not import as much European social technology. I mean, it did import some. There were some attempts to modernize, but not in full. And what you ended up seeing is Egypt has some serious problems today structurally with its, army basically running the economy, massive subsidies. It's not really a free market system. And, here in the United States, we often say Northern Europe is socialist, and, there's a lot of redistribution, but the price signal still works. Everything is relatively transparent. Businesses are transparent. The government sector is kind of under control. And this is in contrast to, say, a lot of the Middle East or, many other societies where the government is basically running everything because they don't have the social technology of individualism, of the that is required, and what weird values Western, uh, you know those Western values of transparency and rule of law. And so I think that's a definite illustration of what you're talking about there. So you wrote an article, though, about social technology in China. Could you kind of introduce it through that direction first?
Hmm. Well, the article I wrote about was social technology in the Zhao dynasty, right? The discussion there was very much centered on how China's society was in a very, very bad state around the time of the late Zhao. This was a period that immediately precedes the Warring States period, right? So there, in fact, was this massive, massive flourishing of different philosophical approaches for what should be done. There seemed to be, at the time, a notable decline in many fundamentals of what could make for a good and safe life. Like the endemic warfare was actually producing serious economic damage and serious damage to human lives, right? So it was like it was not, one could argue that it was a very intellectually productive period, but it was only a very intellectually productive period, this period of the hundred schools, right? The flowering of the hundred schools. It was only a very productive intellectual period after many centuries of decline and this fragmentation into a bunch of essentially independent states, though they still paid, lip service to loyalty to the Zhou dynasty. Um, and in particular, here, the most interesting one is these schools had radically different approaches for how Chinese society should be reformed. And the most interesting thing about it is they all agree Chinese society must be reformed to sort of end this warring states period, right? In the article, I focus on three schools, and this is a little bit of selection effect because obviously, unfortunately, we've lost most of the relevant thinking. This is one of the curses of talking about intellectual history. Say for the ancient Greeks, of known authors, right? Authors that we know by name. For 92% of them, we don't even have fragments preserved, right? This was an estimate I think made in the 1950s. Maybe
Yeah.
it's changed a little bit here, a little bit there, but I would probably, if it's updated for the pieces of writing we have currently, it's probably still about accurate. And the same is very much true of Zhao China, even ignoring, I don't even probably need to go into the later part of the history with the transition from the Qin dynasty to the Han dynasty, when there's a particularly nasty period called, what was it, the burning of books and burying of scholars, right? And
Yeah.
it's what you would imagine. It was a standardization of belief systems. So the reason we say no a lot about legalism is because legalism kind of de facto became the leading and main permitted school of thought in the Qin dynasty. Confucianism was actually itself targeted, but was adapted in the Han dynasty itself. And in the in the in the in the context of the Hundred Schools period, the Confucians and the legalists took almost opposite approaches on a lot of things. Right? Confucius was focused on the reconstruction of the past. He believed that you could use rituals to both moderate people's emotional and social responses to things, right? So you can cultivate yourself, and in fact, your responses become moderated. You behave differently towards your parents, maybe a focus on filial piety. You resolve disputes differently, but also regulation of interpersonal behavior. Rituals are these very, very legible means of resetting the social accounting. Like it's in fact something we take almost for granted. That something like a forgiveness ritual through which two people bury the hatchet, right? Burying the hatchet. Why do we have this term in English? It's probably adapted from either a real or a semi-mythologized practice by Native Americans. That very idiom reveals that there has to be sort of a creation of a forgiveness ritual that makes it legible to the community at large that these two parties, these two feuding parties, are no longer at war. So that would be one example of a ritual that I think can be introduced to a culture, can be practiced by a culture, or might not be, and sort of illustrates that element of social technology there. So Confucius believed that essentially what society needed was for the gentleman scholar to deeply investigate historical rituals used by the early Zhao dynasty centuries later that achieved this harmonious and peaceful and prosperous and just society, possibly extend some principles a little bit. He, for example, was, he and his, you know, um, intellectual descendants such as Mencius and so on, they were often skeptical of the hereditary principle in particular when it came to monarchy. They were, of course, naturally, while claiming great antiquity for their ideas, necessarily reinventing them, right? So whenever you try to
Yeah.
revive or reinterpret a past practice, it's going to be at least half made up new whole cloth. And I think a good example that might be more familiar to a Western audience would be, say, America's Great Revivals, where at every wave, people are like, "Oh, you know what? I think we've actually figured out the true and better and more original Christianity." And then arguably, the Reformation itself is just one big event of that, right? Starting with Martin Luther, proposing that there's a clearer, better, more original Christianity. So there's this way in which an appeal to a distant past, which you don't know much about, can be a justification and a legitimization of whatever reforms you want to enact. However, I don't want to overplay that angle. I do think the Confucians did actually believe they were just kind of restoring the world, right? Restoring the world to a good state, would go out of their ways to acquire any material they could on rituals, and would travel widely between the different states that were composing China of the time, sort of recording in this almost anthropological way, what is done, what's the right way to serve your mother-in-law tea, what's the right way to, determine what to do with a son that refuses to take up the family trade, et cetera, et cetera. And interestingly, we associate rituals with religion, but Confucius was actually not that interested in what is to be done about gods and spirits. He was
Yeah.
mostly interested in what to do about other people.
All right, so let's talk about legalism.
Legalism has a very different approach to the Confucian approach. It starts even with their basic epistemology. There's this, well-known parable. Han Fei, who's one of the bigger scholars, proposes this story about a farmer who one day observes a rabbit hitting his head against a stump, dying, and then proposes, the farmer would be extremely foolish to adopt this as a method of catching rabbits, right? It was a one-time occurrence. It's unlikely to be repeated. And he compared ancient scholars, scholars of antiquity trying to glean insights about the present to the unwise farmer, right? Hoping that, the rabbit's going to bash his skull against the stump once more. Um, he proposed that it's sort of the role that you should look at the present, you should look at it very closely, and according to circumstances, propose remedies, whether or not these remedies are in line with the ancient past. The interesting part of this approach is that it was very deductive, right? They would propose such things as this, observe in their time, probably appropriately, this extremely bleak view of human nature, where humanity by default is bad, is only kept in check by incentives. Therefore, the best you can really do is contain, control humanity's base evil impulses through strong disincentives, such as capital punishment or strict, clearly legible rules. This, I think, actually is is, despite sounding very harsh, remarkably similar to some of the thinking that went into the modern state. I'm reminded here of Hobbes, who again is
Hmm.
someone that's writing in the aftermath of a civil war. So I sort of think there's much to say for this pessimistic view of human nature, but I want to temper it that the people who most espouse the pessimistic view of nature come from troubled times, and then, of course, there are other times when people espouse optimistic view of nature, such as, say, the 18th century before the French Revolution, talking about the noble savage and the inherent goodness of man that's only corrupted by society. Now, this humanist angle to me is less interesting than their focus on producing these very legible, very clear incentive schemes, right? These systems, these bureaucratic processes that essentially are supposed to tie the state together and tie it strongly. And I think it's sort of like it's a little bit of a glass cannon. It works extremely well while it works, but as soon as it doesn't work, it fails completely. Say the very end of the Qin dynasty of China being the one that most adopted legalist philosophy. It was, Qin was kind of the Prussia of China, focused very much on warfare, endorsed harsh measures such as mass executing prisoners of war so as to, have the army move faster. Mass use of labor was, ubiquitous. Mass use of forced labor was ubiquitous among the states at the time, but still, they engaged in some very serious infrastructure projects that were almost, Stalin-esque and a kind of disregard for human life. But the point being about the fragility of the incentives is best illustrated in the decay of the dynasty. The rebellion of Chensheng and Wugang, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing the names, uh, began when the two commanders were delayed moving their troops by heavy rainstorms. This is this seems trivial, right? This seems trivial, excusable, but basically, if you had this entire legal system built on maximum distrust, immediately this puts you in a state of mind when you're very suspicious of excuses, and the law mandates death for being late in this context. So the two commanders reason, well, if we do nothing, we're dead. If we rebel, we're dead. Rather than waiting for death, we might as well die for our own kingdom. And I think this very interestingly illustrates how this kind of approach might incentivize people who are outside of it very quickly to act against you, when in another context they might sort of be brought back to strengthen your system. So I think this kind of legalist system can be functional in the founding generation, but rapidly dissolves once the founders are gone.
Yeah, I guess I would like to say a couple of things in relation to your explanation there, where we have Confucianism, we have legalism, and obviously as a stylized fact, they're presented as two different poles. But of course, the reality is historically we know that by the Han Dynasty, especially the end of the former Han or Western Han, the two had kind of been fused into what became state Confucianism. So
Yes.
a lot of the instruments, the utilitarian aspects of legalism were maintained, but the ethical core, kind of the ideal of Chinese society, was Confucianist. Its foundation, so to speak. And also, the second issue is a lot of the legalists came out of a strand of Confucianism, that of Xunxia, a later strand of Confucianism that was prioritized and fixated on ritual, li, and also had a pessimistic view of human nature. So one could say that here, humans tend to divide things into these dichotomous categories, including the ancients. But the reality is, Confucianism to legalism is a natural spectrum that
Yes.
reoccurs periodically, which you are alluding to by the fact that if you read Hobbes, who I don't know if he knew about legalism, but his all against all and the way that the Leviathan imposes peace and order in a rational
Yes.
manner uh, is straight out of the playbook of legalism. So I think some cultural anthropologists, cognitive anthropologists have this idea of evoked culture. So culture where it's like takes our common cognitive hardware and our pre-built software, our innate ideas, and it's evoked by particular cultural contexts. So you see a situation of cultural chaos. Well, I mean, what did Hobbes see? He saw the chaos of the English Civil War. The legalists, the Confucians, like they're living in the chaos of this, war. They call it the Warring States period for a reason. So they are creating these social cultural philosophies, we would say social technologies, for the fact that there has been a degradation of what maybe Ibn Khaldun would say is asabiya, like social cohesion. How do you recreate the social cohesion? And so legalists, they kind of operate in an almost homo economicus manner. You give people these rational incentives, optimize their utility, but what I would say is legalism, as you say, it's like a glass cannon. It's not anti-fragile. It's not robust. Basically, it gets stuck on a local optimum. In
Yeah.
terms of like, it's really good for a short term, but when there's like some sort of exogenous shock, the system is
Perhaps
easily
the best
collapsing.
analogy for it is a booster rocket, right? It might get you into orbit, or the O-ring might fail and it explodes catastrophically. So it's sort of this kind of it might help the creation, and it might be necessary for the creation of a high trust society to start with the assumption of a very low trust society, of a very maximally antagonistic society.
Yeah. Well, so what relevance do you think that this has to us today? Because I think it has relevance, but I enjoyed your essay. I enjoy your work. I mean, I think human nature on some fundamental level is one. Even if individual humans are very different, on the aggregate, societies deal with the same pressures, the same considerations. Frankly, on some deep level, the same human nature. And so these cultural innovations that we develop, whether it be like the higher religions, um, various forms of bureaucracy, laws that are written down. I mean, they show up over and over again, and it's not a coincidence, right? So, what is the relevance for this past to the present?
Well, the relevance of it is that I think, history is not over, right? Through history not being over, this means that we might very well see the reemergence of social technologies we thought long outmoded, though, again, the branding, the relevant branding of the society might be changed. As mentioned with the Confucians, whenever you want to introduce social reform, you propose that it's most ancient. Well, perhaps a society living in the aftermath of something that styled itself the Enlightenment will have to readopt old social technologies while pretending that they're completely new and groundbreaking. So I think societies rediscover many solutions over and over again. I don't think the full space of human social behavior at scale has been explored. So I think there are definitely new aspects of human nature, new social technologies that have never before been seen that might give rise to, very different systems. But I also think that there's, a sort of well-known cast of possible societal arrangements we've seen. And in fact, the more you come to look at different societies, the more you discover that many aspects of, say, what we might consider modern society are actually universal for, large urbanized populations. It's just the case that large urbanized populations once comprised, say, 5% of the population, might now comprise 50% of the population. If we think of a given
Yeah.
empire, such as the Byzantine Empire, or such as, say, the capitals of the Tang Dynasty or whatever. So the relevance is you can use this as a lens to analyze our own society with fresh eyes, and one
Mhm.
can speculate about the next stage of social development of our own society.
Well, I mean, let's bring it home to America. We have a democratic republic. This is actually an ancient social technology that was used in classical antiquity,
Hmm.
most fully elaborated. I would say ancient Rome. I mean, our original founders were actually more looking at Roman rather than Athenian motifs for various reasons, right? But in any case, so we created this continent scaled democratic republic of yeoman farmers, and it's kind of a new thing. The Europeans were pretty skeptical that we could keep the democratic republic working because they're supposed to only work at city state, city size scales. Like the Roman precedent is that once it became an empire, it was an empire. It became an autocratic system, and so that's what they thought would happen. We're over 200 years into it. It seems like it's working okay. Like we don't know how much longer it's going to last. All things end, but I just think that that's a precedent right there, where an ancient social technology, a system and ideology that was had its phase in antiquity, for a couple of centuries there, and then kind of faded out, was revived in the United States. And I know the Italians, they also had their oligarchic republics, in the Renaissance. So there are certain contexts where these ancient systems are repurposed. And most modern Americans, they kind of vaguely know about the Roman Republic, but really, like, they don't think of that. That's kind of almost an incident or incidental thing. They feel like this is ours. This is, American democracy
It's
is a
completely
unique
freshly
thing.
made. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
that's how
the
they feel.
impression you
That's how
get.
they feel. It's not actually true, but that's how they feel.
Hmm. Well, I mean, I think it's very notable. There's a whole place in the U.S. called Cincinnati, named after Cincinnatus, right? So
Yeah.
why were early American elites going around naming places and cities after ancient Romans? The Roman that after he's done being dictator goes back to the farm like a good citizen, right? Because being dictator is something the Senate calls you to, and so on, and you do it for the good of Rome, not for the good of Rome, not because you really want to. And they saw this as an ideal. They also thought George Washington was such a figure, right? Because he,
Yeah.
declined to be president for too long, setting sort of a two-term precedent. Even though the 20th century showed the two-term precedent was very flexible, right? And there was no written part of the Constitution that say could have prevented FDR from being president, three times or four times, like he was. Um,
He could have been like the Gaius Marius of our time, and in fact, in some ways, he was the Gaius Marius of our time.
Yeah, very much so. So the US, and if you read the founding fathers, they debate these historical examples exhaustively, right? And it's not just because this is part of their culture and this is how you legitimize stuff. If it was about culture, they would have focused on Christian and theological arguments. Those certainly would have been more interesting to, the bulk of the population of North America at that time. really this was an educated man's game, and they were trying to make the intellectual case that something like this was possible, but also design around it, right? Make something like a federation of republics. The idea being that, okay, there could be a way to scale this technology that has never scaled beyond a small city state successfully if we take these innovations, if we take these ideas from it. When you read these discussions that they're having, it's super interesting, right? The early idea for the president and the vice president is that actually they should be, oppositional to each other during the election. That the vice
Hmm.
president should be the guy that failed to become president, and then that the authorities of the two, you start looking at it and you're like, oh, okay, were they trying to set up a diarchy, something like a system of consuls, and so on. The reverse engineering is very explicit. And I think that this is something Americans are still conscious of in the middle of the 19th century. So this still influences, say, the thinking of Lincoln. I don't think it influences the thinking of 20th century US presidents that much. I think they
Mm.
basically believe, they start believing first in Anglo exceptionalism. So if you asked Theodore Roosevelt, he'd talk to you about the Anglo Saxons rather than the Romans. And then about by FDR, I think that's the point where they truly believe in American exceptionalism and uniqueness. And again, America is unique in many regards. It is an exceptional country, uh, but all great countries are unique, and it's not the only great country historically. And it has this vast debt in social technology to, honestly, just a bunch of ancient writing and this general diffusion of Roman and Greek ideas that, happened during the Renaissance.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've had these discussions about the importance of ideology and the explicit framework as opposed to tacit, organic. A Marxist would look at material conditions. I don't look at purely material conditions. These economic factors. So, for example, Joe Henrich at Harvard, he has a book called "The Weirdest People in the World." I've done a podcast with him, and I don't necessarily believe his whole theory, but his idea is the breakdown, basically, the Western marriage family program of the Roman Catholic Church, or the proto-Roman Catholic Church, broke down cousin marriage and destroyed the power of kindreds, of related, whether fictively or in reality, paternal male lineages, which were so powerful in ancient Rome, the gens, and remained powerful in China, in South Asia, and West Asia, basically everywhere except for Western Europe. And his thesis is, okay, this happened for various historically contingent reasons to a great extent, because the Roman Church was the last high culture legitimating force in Western Europe for these barbarian kingdoms. Okay, so all this happened. This wasn't conscious. This was not some explicit plan, but the destruction of the kindreds allowed for the emergence of civil society and third party institutions. So this created this path dependency to the modern world, the weird world where laws take precedence over human judgment. And we also have the resurrection of these ancient classical forms, which actually predate Henrich's ideas. So, we don't know if Henrich's ideas are totally correct. My only point is there may be some non ideological priors that are coming in here that are synthesizing with this explicit ideological scaffold, right? So, if you have a non weird society and you try to create a democratic republic, the social technology might have some different outcomes, right?
Yes, certainly. I would note that, say, the breaking of kinship relations is explicitly discussed at least by St. Augustine and Aquinas as the rationale behind the ban on cousin marriage. So the Catholic Church is thinking about, okay, how do we get the Christian community to care about each other as Christians are supposed to, rather than just focus on the immediate family the way, all humans ever have.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they deploy these arguments. So the full scope of the consequences of the social technology certainly could not have been predicted in advance, but the initial engineering might have been done in advance. It's
Yeah.
similar to the inventor of dynamite certainly has an explicit model of dynamite, though might not imagine all the uses it might eventually be put to.
Yeah. This is an interesting question that you propose, and it actually suggests a domain of scholarly investigation, because The Roman Catholic Church isn't the only church that is concerned with familialism or only religious institution. So Buddhism, which has a class of celibate monks in all of its branches, has traditionally run up against familialism as a serious problem. This actually caused huge problems for Buddhism in China because it's totally in opposition to Confucian familialism, right? So, we could look and investigate and see how, if there are situations where the Buddhist church, the Buddhist hierarchy is more powerful, whether they too also engaged in a marriage family program. So, I'm thinking like, let's look at Tibet. I actually don't know. The details in Tibet, but there's some historical reasons that Tibet had an extremely powerful religious hierarchy after the collapse of the aristocratic rule, right? So it could be this is a general tendency with these institutions that are bound by ideas, because that's what these higher religions are. They're bound by an idea that can get transmitted through these books over the generations, and that is a total counter opposition to the more proximate, like familial considerations, where obviously most people's natural impulse through kin selection or through other psychological methods is to help your kin rather than turn away from your kin.
I mean, certainly. Here we could possibly discuss about the difference between the explicit and the implicit. I do want to just make sure that it's clear that I do agree that there's this vastly important area that is implicit, that is never rendered explicitly either in word or writing. Practice, right? Practice captures far more than an explicit theoretical rendition might. However, in the course of pursuing a theoretical rendition, you might come to rediscover a lot of that implicit practice. Now, the benefit of the explicit is that it travels vastly better than the implicit. If you have these, big axial age religions that are sort of trying to terraform millions and millions of people, right? Modify, re-educate, enlighten, whatever terminology you might want to use, it's a massive social engineering program to say convert the Roman Empire to Christianity. I think the estimates I've read on it is that at the time when Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, puts Christianity in a favorable position, the estimates are that 10, 20% of the population are Christian at most. And the same can be said of the other great religions. Again, Buddhism is a state religion in China for a while before it's replaced and radically suppressed. Tibet, you have this extremely developed theocracy. And you can deliver much more practice, I would say, in this sort of like lifelong king relationship. And the lifelong king relationship where you just sort of start as, someone's child, you work in the family business, you grow up, your parents might still be around advising you how to run the family business even though you're running it. That has a lot of time and space to transfer implicit knowledge. Meanwhile, you're Christianizing a region. Well, you have to rely on explicit statements. In a way, the credo is about as explicit as you can get as a sort of, litmus test of are you Christian, are you not Christian? Can you say these words that you believe this, right?
Yeah. Well, so I don't want to get through the rabbit hole of religion and religious anthropology. I would say that the creed is important, obviously, and especially for nerds like us, these explicit formal creeds loom large. But
Yes.
in a lot of areas of the world, the way higher religions are spread through peasant masses is through things like liturgies and rituals
Yes.
and processions. And so that's a different form of meme. It's not a I wouldn't say rational, but it's not an axiomatic meme. It's more of like an
Agreed.
imagistic meme. These images are, and so that you're associating your Christian belief with the image of the Mother Mary or particular saints' days
But
or the
but the
Mass.
thing that keeps the mass and the liturgy consistent across Europe or North America or South America or whatever is the weird nerdy texts the priests are reading. And okay,
Yeah.
sure, the bureaucratic hierarchy where each individual priest is fully replaceable. So those two things together, I think, are sort of the scaling mechanism. But I definitely agree that the transmission to the broad mainstream of the population has to be different, right? That has to be embedded in some
Mhm.
sort of mass practice, right? So we're back at ritual, I guess.
Yeah, well, Li, which is like super important in Confucianism. I do have to say, like, recently someone asked me, "What do you think about the targeting of Brahmins by Muslims in parts of like Indian history during the medieval period with the Islamic invasions?" And my response is simple: you shoot the brain, you kill the brain, and the body dies. So I do think obviously intellectual
Yes.
elites that have access to literacy are essential for the maintenance of many cultures and societies and their cultural memory. Although I do have a question, since you are liminally Eastern European, I know Slovenia is not really, but you're Slavic, so
Yes.
that kind of makes you honorary. Um, I've always been fascinated. How did groups like the Finns and the Lithuanians maintain their peasant culture despite being dominated for centuries by in Lithuania's case by Polonized elites, and in Finland's case by Swedish elites? Like, have you ever read about how these European folk cultures maintained themselves until they like erupted back in the 19th century with romantic nationalism?
I never really read explicitly about the Finns. I found the Baltic region more interesting because it's the part of Europe that persists in quote unquote paganism the longest, right? And also engages in some measures of religious reform towards something like an organized religion, right? The Lithuanian portion, at least.
Yeah.
Um, I think the very important part of this is that the elites of the Swedes and later the Russians are in a way they are in a way primarily military elites, and I think military elites tend to be relatively poor at assimilating the underlying population. So I think you also see this pattern with nomadic horse people, right? If a nomadic horse people brings in a new religion, sometimes, the people will just adopt, say, the language of the conqueror and so on. But if they don't, it's the invaders that tend to melt away. Now, in the case of Finland and Sweden, obviously there's a huge part of the Kingdom of Sweden that speaks Swedish, right? The whole part that's west of the sea. And for Lithuania, though, I think that the main thing that saved the Lithuanians was probably just the collapse of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which I did read about. It seems that the late elite were Polonized, and that the Polish language was in fact expanding through that Commonwealth. And it's sort of say the conquest by the Russians stops that process. And you could say the Russians were much worse at assimilation, but 1991, 1990, collapse of the Soviet Union, that time period, some of these states were like 30 or 40% Russian. So again, maybe maybe they're twice lucky. First
Yeah.
the interruption of the Polonization under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, then the interruption of the Russian Empire. I think one of the things to keep in mind is that I think assimilation is also very nonlinear. So you might have like a 300-year history of assimilation of a conquered period, and it's only say 50 years, almost towards the end of the assimilatory period, that there's like 20% of the people engaged in the new culture. But once it's 20, it might very quickly become 50. It might very quickly become 90 or 100%. That at least seems to be the case with the 19th century with mass language switching within Europe, though that's the big confounding factor there is schooling, right? Where in a way we can compare schooling to mass. Maybe, and this is the fun part, maybe the most important part of kids being brought into a classroom is that they're forced to, speak French rather than Occitan or Breton or whatever. And what they're learning is like way less relevant than the fact that they're just punished in class if they speak a non-French language. That from the perspective of the French state, maybe, the language education in the 19th century was by far the most important effect of schooling, even perhaps more so than literacy.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, here in 2020, we are in a time of transition. I want to ask you about China. Everyone has an opinion on what's going on in the world, multipolarity, all these things. You said something about China becoming wealthy, and on social media, on Twitter, people were pushing back. And so, what I would say, um, is and I've actually written a piece for City Journal. It should be out soon. Termed Twilight Empire, and it's not about China. It's about the United States. But um, but in any case, it alludes to China. So my contention is, and I think you said the same thing too. And I swear to God, I thought this before you did. So maybe great minds think alike. I feel like the cultural influence and overhang is a lagging indicator to economic and even military power. So I feel like the United States feels, I mean, we still are number one. We're great. We're powerful. But I think we feel more powerful and more important than we are, in fact, right now in 2020. What do you think about that?
That's certainly true. That's certainly true. I mean, to Americans, the pretensions of the French seem ridiculous, but to the French, they still actually hold them. Now, perhaps they hold less to them than they did 50 years ago, or 70 years ago, or 100 years ago, but think of how long it is since France was a first rate power, yet how persistent that cultural cachet is. Or say the British Empire, or say the Roman Empire, long dead and gone, still inspired imitation in the 18th century and endless discussion in the 20th century. So I think the self perception of the US is actually that nothing can threaten the US at home. There's no realistic foreign enemy at home. And I think this is completely true. And the awareness of the broader empire is very peripheral. It's incorrect to say that America today is a very globalized country. I think it's an extremely inward looking country that, however, has as its ideology that it's universal, and while it was very economically and militarily powerful, its very inward looking ideology would completely displace, and culture would completely displace Europe, right? Or completely displace entire cultures in, East Asia. I think, the age when 30 or 40% of the Korean population might, after some U.S. occupation, just convert to Protestant Christianity because I guess that's what the winners do. I think those days are over. I think the U.S.'s influence will be maintained for, sorry, the perception of U.S. predominance will be maintained all the way until a large military defeat, which the Chinese, if they're smart about it, won't ever undertake to effect. Right? They'll just work on the fundamentals and they'll avoid a direct military confrontation. Because in a way, if you let your opponent know that they're defeated, that's problematic for a whole variety of reasons. It might cause reform. It might cause revival.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really great point. So one thing that I wonder about, from your perspective as a, you were, raised outside the United States, I believe, uh,
Yes,
and I totally agree with you. We're an inward-looking, narcissistic, self-absorbed culture that confuses the rest of the world with our own culture. The recent cultural conflicts, the culture wars that are happening here. I feel like America is using 20th century social technology, social events, cultural events, and just trying to project them forward into the 21st century. Do you see that same thing or something different?
I think that's certainly a big part of the story. Maybe America's again trying to catch the rabbit by hoping that it hits its head on the log. I think that it's sort of there is a particular cultural recipe that proved very, very good for a period of hegemony, right? And I think let's review some of the strong points of American culture. First off, I think America has amazing assimilation culture. I think people often underestimate the power of assimilation of non-American cultures, but I think this is, definitely true of the U.S. The U.S. can reliably steal the best and brightest, which is another way of saying America continually decapitates the elites of its potential rivals by having those elites emigrate into the U.S. Right? If you're a very, very ambitious European, there's really no reason to stay in Europe, even in 2020. And that's sort of a damning indictment of the entire European Union project. The same is also true, of course, if you're a very talented Nigerian or if you're a very ambitious Brazilian. Unless, again, you're very, very predisposed to some sort of nationalist ideology where you take the personal hit to your life trajectory in order to affect your ideology. Um, the This is one strength. Again, another strength was perhaps this assumption of American inevitability. Now, this actually presupposes victory, like the idea that the US might lose a serious war against a rival state that's an equal. I think that just doesn't enter imagination. The idea that, say, the US might be at war with a serious rival, where the serious rival might have good points rather than simply be the bad guy, right? The enemy has to be the evil empire. Like, that's a
Yeah.
very useful, very adaptive belief. The fact that Americans didn't back and forth about the benefits and weaknesses of the Soviet Union, but instead just declared it the evil empire, I think that was very useful instrumentally for the U.S. in the 70s and 80s. I think it was significantly, but not fully true even then. But this was like a one-sided blindness. But this belief in victory, belief in moral superiority, um, basically strong good assimilation, or at least the belief that you can always assimilate your enemy's elites. These are all premises that are perhaps no longer true in the 21st century. I note that the vast majority of sorry, not the vast majority, for now just the majority, but I believe in the near future, the vast majority of Chinese studying in America return to China. I think this is a very important point that people are not thinking about. Unlike most other countries, when your best and brightest go to the U.S. to study, they come back to China. I also think that's very important. Like I think the U.S. will not be able to assimilate the Chinese elite. Arguably, the U.S. was even capable of assimilating the Soviet elite. At least if we count, if we jokingly count London as part of America, it's certainly part of America's, extended empire.
Yeah. I I always think we should basically break Britain up into a bunch of different states and then admit them, because I think it would be great if like Americans could vacation in London in July and August and then fly back and there'd be no issue. And you could do summer internships there and appreciate the history, because here in the United States something is really old if it's 200 or 300 years old. So it's like Europe is just like incredible with stuff going back to the Middle Ages, right? And so I do want to pivot to Europe. I love Europeans. I love European culture. It's super rich. It's like the most extensive rich area of the world still, I guess, just in terms of like the European political union, the European Union. um but I also feel like it's kind of a I don't know, it's kind of like it's a dying continent. I mean, this is like an exaggeration, but just looking at the total fertility rate and other things, I'm not saying that the Europeans are it's going to turn into like Africa North or anything like that, because like Europeans do have armies; they can still prevent people from coming north. But my issue is just like demographically, it's not going to punch to the same extent, and it's become more and more marginal over time in a multipolar world as the world, frankly, rebalances towards Asia. And so I just wonder, like, do you have any sense of how Europeans view this? We're talking about cultural overhang, and this was, in 1900, Europe was basically the whole world, especially if you include like the United States as part of, extended Europe, right?
Yes.
And now, I don't know. It's like the Chinese have been known to start bullying smaller European nation states now with economic threats. So it's a whole new world. Have they internalized that? Do they understand their role in the world?
I think the answer is just no. I have an article in the National Interest titled, um, you know, America wants why America wants a weak and peaceful Europe. I think part of it is that Europe was incredibly warlike all the way up until World War II. In the aftermath of World War II, it's occupied by Russia and the United States. These you could kind of call them as European extensions, right? The Russians extend eastward, are kind of like a little bit their own civilization, kind of Europeanized, colonized Siberia. Americans, kind of this offshoot of the British Empire. Um, but the result of it is these very divided, very small militaries. And I think European culture after World War II can be best described as, you know, making making sort of virtue a virtue of necessity, right? The sort of sour grapes type attitude towards military power. It's not that Europeans are just so cheap that they don't want militaries. It's that NATO actively coordinates to make individual European militaries serve more usefully as part of this, strange, combined forces NATO force against the hypothetical Soviet enemy that doesn't even exist anymore, rather than militaries that could independently intervene around the world. The U.S. has no interest in European countries that could independently intervene around the world. The role of Europeans is to be, at most, militarily, part of a coalition of the willing, right? For those of us who still remember the early 2000s. So military paths were blocked, but they were blocked for so long that I think Europeans just currently believe that the peace in Europe is maintained by good feeling and a high amount of mutual trade rather than U.S. military hegemony, which is, I think, a straightforward reading of European history, is that peace in Europe right now is maintained by U.S. military hegemony.
Yeah.
Um, and of course, this hegemony will recede eventually. However, what's the consequence of this false model of the world? A consequence is the Europeans believe we are more morally evolved, right? And we're more morally evolved on dimensions that are basically stolen from American ideology, which we don't even know is American ideology. In a way, Europe has, sort of Disneyland Paris, right? I think all of Europe is a little bit of a Disneyland Paris, where several national identities, especially in Western Europe, have sort of morphed themselves to match how Americans view them, right? We re-ingest these perceptions. And more importantly here, this belief in moral superiority, in moral progress, means that Europeans were just as predisposed as Americans to believe that as the Chinese grew richer, they would become more like us, right? They would eventually start to be rabid environmentalists. They would
Yeah.
eventually move towards democratic systems. They would be multipolar. They're technocratic. Don't you know? Xi Jinping has a science degree. He's almost like Angela Merkel. Eventually, we're all going to be riding our little Vespa scooters and, have a green countryside. And, China is going to have its own traditional architecture, and we'll probably grant them special privileges on their noodles, and they'll grant us special privileges on our wine, and we're going to sell them wine, and they're going to sell us Chinese food or whatever, right? I'm joking, but that's actually how European countries relate to each other, right? They grant each other regional farm, America does farm subsidies by making corn, have a negative price, by just dumping money into corn. Europe does it by letting every single valley decide that its special kind of cheese or special kind of wine or special kind of pickle herring should be trademarked. That's where the joke about champagne comes from, right? That it's actually only champagne if it's from the Champagne region of France. That's straight up consequence of these kind of laws that allow them to maintain this. So I think Europe's idea was we become very culturally superior, we become super pro equality, pro environmentalism. We're at the inevitable end of history, and the only thing left to do is to really build very nice museums to what we used to be. And the assumption was that the same would happen in China, that the same would happen in the third world once it developed. So the second assumption, that it's free trade and a high degree of free trade that is keeping the peace rather than U.S. military hegemony, well, what do you think the consequence of that was from 1991 to about 2020 with their view of China? They believed peace and good
Yeah.
relations with China were guaranteed as long as we traded with them enough, which is insane. But to be fair, was a widely held position.
Yep.
Um, let me note, I don't think China's rise is wholly negative for Europe. I do believe there will be many individual countries that greatly benefit from China's rise, but I do believe China will be able to effectively play off individual European states against each other. And if they're good enough at that game, they might stop the process of federalism that the European Union lurches to after every crisis, right? Note that the main effect of the European Union being unable to coordinate a single response during the COVID pandemic has been to grant further powers to the European Union bureaucracy to make sure that come next pandemic, which honestly might be a century from now, uh, you know, they'll be able to act effectively. Those legal powers and so on, those mechanisms put in place, their main political effect will have nothing to do with this pandemic. Their main political effect will express itself in a hundred small other ways, right? So the big question for Europe is, can it really sort of incrementally, bureaucratically creep all the way to a unified European military? If the answer is yes, then the future has a Europe that's united militarily, that's perhaps a second rate power, but does remain a second rate power, sort of like Russia is today. Or the bureaucratic creep cannot produce, right? This sort of bureaucratic sort of amalgamation can never produce a unified military, in which case I think they'll be perpetually played against each other.
Well, so let's pivot as we close out. Like I want to talk about China, which is where we started. We started 2,000 years ago or 2,500 years ago, and now I feel like it's a good time again to talk about China because, you know, we remember the year 2000. We remember China was going to be the future. All of these think pieces and Time magazine, or whatever glossy Der Spiegel. And it's really strange for me, as a person entering middle age. Okay, well, the future's here now. China is the future, and it's would be ludicrous to write an article about how China is the power of the future, because in a way China is the
China
power
is
of the
the
present.
present.
Yeah, it's
Yes.
the present. It's here. And I have seen the exact same thing that you have seen of graduate students going back to China. I have seen and known of academics who are of Western origin going to China. I have a friend who said that if he could get a good offer in China, he would go to China. And he's from Kentucky. Okay, he's an academic.
Yes.
That sounds like a really bizarre thing to tell someone in 1995, but in 2020, it's not quite crazy for various reasons, you know. And so here we are, and you think deeply about these historical geopolitical questions. um you know what is your top line? Like, what would you advise an American listener who is focused still on the considerations of the Reagan Revolution, of the Civil Rights era? Like, all of these historical events in the 20th century have great resonance for us, while I feel like history is passing us by right now, with the pivot to Asia for the rest of the world. Like, I have family in South Asia and Bangladesh, and I can tell you, 10 years ago, they would go on vacation to Europe, and now they just go to Singapore, they go to Hong Kong, sometimes they go to Dubai, but they kind of stopped going to Europe all of a sudden, and I don't think it was a conscious choice.
Yeah, these things are always sort of determined by what is trending in your environment, right? These fashions, they shift very quickly. Tastes shift very quickly. You suddenly discover a taste for figs and olive oil after the legionaries are all around you. But the thing that I would comment on is, for me, the real wake up call is that yes, the future is here and China is the dominant power. Was reading, I think this headline. It might have been in Wired magazine, which I don't even read anymore. I think its quality, unfortunately, has declined somewhat. And the title was "Why Shenzhen is the Silicon Valley of Hardware." I mean,
Wait, wait,
you have
is it Silicon Valley is the Shenzhen of like social media?
right, right. And let's note that the latest, hottest social media network, TikTok, is a Chinese is a Chinese innovation, right?
Yes.
It
Yeah.
outcompeted in America Vine. I think it was always a cope. It was always a rationalization that once Shenzhen is the Silicon Valley of China, sorry, once Shenzhen is the Silicon Valley of hardware, right? Once that point happened, I think Chinese software dominance was in fact inevitable as well, because that's how the development stack will just proceed. They make the hardware and they bundle their software with the hardware and they design their software to fit their hardware. It's only a matter of time before they're better than Apple at that game. And the status markers, as you observed with your family, will shift so that a new, beautifully branded Chinese product will in fact be very, very desirable. I think they'll
Yeah.
succeed at this. I think China's materialism, you know, as far as cultural values go, crass materialism has its disadvantages, but one of its advantages is it puts sharply into focus the bragging game, the material goods game. It allows you to eventually figure out like very, very good marketing for your materials, especially if your materials are actually quite good. So that was the dividing line for me. That was the wake up call, because when I saw that headline, a whole class of arguments that used to be so relevant dropped off. The arguments were, oh, China might catch up with the West, but the Western world is more innovative. Well, what's evidence of recent Western innovation? It's Silicon Valley. So, okay, if I look in the future and 20 years from now, China is dominating artificial intelligence and is dominating social media and is dominating software, and it's also, of course, dominating hardware because, hello, they're dominating hardware today. Where exactly is this Western innovation coming from? Where exactly is this, out innovating future going to come from that supposedly overcomes a massive demographic advantage, 1.3 billion people? Now, of course,
Yeah.
only about 4 to 500 million people are living according to, let's say, the standards of modern day Poland. By the way, modern day Poland I would count as a first world country. So China is a first world country and a third world country in a single country. But, let's be frank, the proportions might be a little bit different, but doesn't that describe the US? And doesn't that describe, almost
Yeah.
every sufficiently large modern state? I think it does. So I think for Americans, a look outward might be very important. Today you won't necessarily gain many friends or win a local debate in a college environment by focusing on the issues the Chinese care about or the issues that the world is focusing on. But I guarantee you, 30, 20 years from now, suddenly this culture that you believed was completely internally driven, completely following its own internal logic, the ontology will just seem hopelessly obsolete. There'll be a whole class of questions no one will care about in 20 or 30 years because the most prestigious source of ideology and the most prestigious source of culture will have shifted. Another important metric here is the Chinese no longer really watch Hollywood. Among
Yeah.
top grossing movies are Chinese movies made for a Chinese audience. I had, I think might have been on Tyler Cowen's recommendation, or might have been someone else's. I watched the movie The Wandering Earth. I was on a plane, had too much time, and I really was amused by there was this kind of very buddy cop moment where the Chinese main character is, friends with the Russian cosmonaut character, and the Russian is joking, being this whimsical sidekick who's joking about how Russians invented space stations. And of course, the Russian tragically dies while, being a good friend to the Chinese main character. Uh, I realized I've seen this movie before.
Yeah.
It's what we jokingly referred to when I was growing up in the 1990s in Slovenia. We referred to this, what's happening? And my dad would say, Američani opet rešujejo svet. Translated, the Americans are saving the world again. What's happening on TV? The Americans are saving the world again. So when I watched it, I was like, oh, okay, what's happening in this movie? The Chinese are saving the world again. That's going to be a genre, and it's going to include friendly nations such as the Russians as the goofy sidekick, much as say, non-Russian speaking Europeans like French or Italians or people from Spain or Mexico might have been included as goofy sidekicks in American action movies.
Yeah. So you have a perspective as a person who grew up outside the United States. One thing that I say, and I think this is just partly because I'm American and this is my quote lived experience. I feel like America has a moralistic vision that is more portable internationally,
Hmm.
whereas China's vision is not quite as moralistic; it's more transactional. And so I wonder, like, what do you think of that? Or do you, and I'm asking you partly because like you grew up in Slovenia in the 1990s. Like, was America viewed in that way by people outside of the country? Did it seem like America was transactional? Is this a delusion
Uh,
of our own educational system?
I think America was seen as more transactional than it was viewed in the United States. There was definitely a real idealistic element. The belief was, in fact, okay, the Americans kind of invented this democracy thing. And I guess this democracy thing, I guess it does make for better electronics and it makes for a better dishwasher and makes for a, better, nicer home. And, we get to eat in McDonald's. I guess McDonald's is good food, right? There's this funny experience when I was growing up where the McDonald's was actually an upper middle class place to go eat because it was such an exotic novelty, right?
Yeah.
1990s, Eastern Europe, post communist space. Slovenia used to be part of Yugoslavia. And my mom, when I asked her, so what was your experience? What were the advantages and the disadvantages of a system I was technically born in? I was born in 1988, so I was about 3 years old when communism ended in Slovenia. 1991 is the year it declared independence. And my mom answered, well, it used to be the case that everyone could get work and that everyone would get a house. But I think on net, it's much better now. Workers don't necessarily get a house, but electronics are so much cheaper, and home appliances are so much better, and the clothing looks better, and the interior decorating is better. That's a very honest answer from my mom. And so we have
Yeah.
to ask ourselves if the Chinese are making better electronics and better dishwashers and better everything, and if the Chinese system provides these better goods, you know, I feel like it's sort of the moralistic vision of America is writing a check. And the big question is not whether it's a beautifully written check, but does the check bounce when you try to cash it? So I think it's necessary
Mm.
but insufficient to have a grand moralistic vision of the world for great cultural influence. And the Chinese, their credit is solid. Not literally but metaphorically. They lifted 400 to 500 million people out of poverty. When you
Yeah.
read Steven Pinker's book, the book, either Enlightenment Now or Better Angels of Our Nature, I actually really loved Better Angels of Our Nature. It's a good book. When you see that beautiful graph about dropping global poverty, if you subtract China from it, it's basically flat.
Yeah.
So that graph actually embeds, you know, truthfully embeds a big lie, as all the best statistics do. And it's that, actually on developmental grounds, socialism with Chinese characteristics worked. And of course, Americans scoff and say, no, this is not socialism. This is actually capitalism. And I have to say, well, you know what? It's like, scoffing at the Pope's definition of Catholicism. If they say this is what socialism is, well, guess what? This is what people in 50 years will think socialism is.
Yeah. Yeah, that's intense. Like I hadn't thought of it that way. So I had a conversation recently with a friend of mine who worked at the World Bank, and he was stationed in Bangladesh and in the mid-teens, and we had a lot of things that we talked about. One thing that I took away from it though is that people in India wonder about the Bangladesh relationship and the Bangladesh problem, which is less of a problem now because people don't migrate from Bangladesh to India because Bangladesh's economy is actually a little better right now. But in any case, that's a separate issue. He said from the Bangladesh perspective, it's totally different because Bangladesh focuses more on Southeast Asia and East Asia in terms of its economic, just it's an export driven economy, right? So it's more like an East Asian economy where, export in terms of manufacturers. Whereas India is more service, it's kind of like a confused jumble of service and permit Raj socialism and all these things. And so it's just interesting because, these two groups they're both culturally the same, they're biologically very similar, and yet they've taken somewhat different turns just because of development choices and proximity. And it's interesting, the perspective varies between the two countries, and they don't really understand each other anymore.
Right, right. I mean, the perspective shift in that whole area is going to be massively shaped by China, especially I think the Pakistan-China relationship is going to be one of the more important global relationships for India, and how things develop in that part of the world because of that.
Yeah, it's kind of be
Uh,
like Pakistan's like Scotland, India's like England, and China's like France. It's like the old alliance is, I mean, like it's like these again, like these like common reoccurring themes will happen over and over in human history.
right, right. But then, of course, in a way, China has been expanding into what would have naturally perhaps been India's sphere of influence with massive investments in East Africa, with
Yeah.
a strong hand in Southeast Asia, with close relations with Pakistan, not to mention Sri Lanka, and more recently also, like, massive investments in the Middle East. So the interesting question is, where exactly is India's sphere of influence? And does it
Yeah.
anywhere at all, not clash with China's? In a way,
Yeah.
is who will dominate Indian Ocean trade is a notable factor. People focus on, they talk about the Pacific century. I don't think this is going to be the Pacific century at all. If you look at the amount of trade going over the Pacific, I bet it's, I think if you look at the derivative, so how much is that trade growing over time? I think it's basically done. I think China and the US are trading about everything they can trade. And, China and Australia are trading about everything they can trade. And Latin America, sure, there's some growth there, but that's about that. What's the one great ocean where shipping might, because of economic growth of the relevant countries around it, still increase by a factor of two or three or four? I think it's the Indian Ocean. So perhaps this is the Indian century, but not the Indian as in India, but India as an Indian Ocean.
Hmm.
Already, the reason the Straits of Malacca are so important for China is because that's where their oil comes from, shipped across the Indian Ocean from the Middle East. And trade between China and Europe, right? Europe, an economy as big as the US, if we're talking about the European Union, that goes through the Indian Ocean too.
Yeah, I should let you go, but I do want to end with the perceptions culturally of what is important in the history. And what is important now, I've had multiple conversations with Indians where I point out they're obsessed with Islam and Muslims. They're obsessed with the British period and colonialism.
That's obsession with the past,
Yeah, and
not the
I'm just
future.
like, you do understand that the number one economy in 10 years is, I mean, depending on purchasing power, all these, but I mean, it's right to your north. And you're already, in a way, you're already obsessed with being inferior and like, China is lapping you and all these things. And yet you're expending all of this mental energy looking west and like thinking about like the Britishers and colonialism. Your economy is bigger than the United Kingdom's economy now. This is not
Right.
this is not something to talk about or think about or care about. Like, figure out how you can fix your future and not the legacy of things that happened before, like, 98% of your population was born, but cultural memory doesn't work like that.
Well, I think it is possible to narrativize a history that will satisfy these needs. If Vladimir Putin can find a way to endorse the Soviet Union but condemn Stalin, or to put it this way, endorse Stalin's defeat of Hitler but condemn everything else about Stalin, and condemn Western anti-Soviet propaganda while simultaneously endorsing, condemning communism. I think possibly India can do something like you know, focus, sort of find a way to square its history, right? The humiliations of the past are never undone. And in a way, China had a much easier time, right? China China's response to humiliation was, well, these great European powers humiliated us, including, in a way, the US is counted in that for some reason, but, it's kind of counted into that. And now they're strong, and now these people that used to humiliate them are weak. But by the time India is strong, Europe's not going to be a big factor, and the U.S. was, not an ally to India, but basically irrelevant to the development of India. So
Yeah, it's just interesting how myopic people can be. You're on the Asian continent during what is basically the Asian century. Like, Africa's demographic increase hasn't had a major impact on global power
affairs,
balance
yeah.
yet. you know and so, but you're still obsessed with European colonialism from the early 20th century and the 19th century. This is like such a misdirection of energy, and I think your point is taken. We need to find narratives, we need to find theories that can allow us to deal with the present, that still integrate the past, that's emotionally resident, right? That's what you're saying.
Right, right. I mean, maybe a formula like this can be found that, everything, it's perhaps a crude nationalist formula, but maybe everything strong, unique, and dynamic about Western civilization was taken from India, and, every injustice, done by it is sort of the product of them not quite understanding Indian thought very well. This historically is like certainly not true, but maybe that's enough to, heal a wounded ego and allow you to set up your own little dichotomy where it's West versus East, and it's China versus India, the same as it's ever been. The last 10,000 years of human history have always been China versus India. There was this weird offshoot of India called Europe for a while. It made some mistakes, it made some breakthroughs, but now we're back at it.
it's
That
that
kind of view might work.
Yeah, it's the Chindian century, man. I mean, that should be the new mantra. But we'll see if that works. So the last thing I want to say, um, what is this? Any sufficiently advanced technology is magic, right? So what is any sufficiently socially advanced technology? Is that
I
magic
think
as
it's
well?
I think it's also magic. I think it's really crazy and ludicrous and borderline magical that there's a man in a white suit in a former imperial capital that is still considered among the most important people in the world. I'm talking about the Pope, of course,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like that's magic. That's magic. And again, there's nothing short of magic the way we've been able to deploy material technology at a scale of millions of people. This is not purely a consequence of material technology. It never could be, right?
yeah.
It never could be. It was co-developed. So, in a very serious sense, the fact that we could do things such as break out of kin relationships, even though we weren't necessarily evolved for it, and note break out, perhaps atomization will eventually show us that we needed some of those kin relationships and that we've perhaps overshot as to what's biologically sustainable for humans. But still, that was necessary for scaling. The fact that millions of people can be educated into a mutually compatible language, that's, if it wasn't so mundane, that would be magic. It really would be.
Well, Samo, we've been talking for a while. This has been a really great conversation. Obviously, we hit on a lot of things. I'm hoping that as people are listening, they're open up Wikipedia, looking up a few things because I think we just dropped a few references in there just to like stretch the listener a little bit. And like let's do this again, man.
I'd be very happy to come back. Thank you for having me. Very simple.
This podcast for kids. This is my favorite